But thank you guys. I'll pass it over to Joel, and you're in good hands.
Thank you.
Hello, for anybody that just hopped on the call with us right now, we're just going to be putting this on Facebook Live, so if you'll bear with us, we'll get started momentarily. Hello, if you're hopping in the live right now, we are broadcasting on Facebook Live, so please hold on one moment and we'll get started shortly. It looks like we had some more people just join. Just hold on 1 second with us. We are just broadcasting on Facebook Live and making sure that's all set up. Perfect. Well, awesome. I would like to, first off, I would like to thank each and every one of you for hopping on the call with us this week. And for our new semester of Unifying Our Alumni Voice, our webinar series. And for our first episode, today we'll be welcoming the co-founders of Jewish on Campus. We're welcoming here Isaac de Castro and Julia Jassey. They are co-founders, co-CEOs, co-directors, whatever you want to call it. They are also hosts of the Jewish Identity Crisis podcast. Julia is a second-year student at the University of Chicago studying political science with a focus on international relations. And Isaac is a senior at Cornell University studying the history of architecture and urban development. And before further ado, I'll pass it off to Isaac and Julia so they can tell you a little bit about what they do, and then we'll hop into questions.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having us. I'm super excited to be here. And it's great to be here with Isaac because we do all of our work together, but have never done a panel together. So this is a first time for that, which is exciting. So Isaac and I both co-run and co-started the nonprofit organization called Jewish on Campus. We started off as an Instagram page back in July, basically to document the stories of anti-Semitism that we were experiencing, we were seeing, because we knew that this was a problem, but a problem that wasn't being talked about enough, of anti-Semitism happening on college campuses. And so a group of us got together and I realized that we should start a platform to share that. And it grew in popularity very quickly. And since then we began a nonprofit organization to combat that and to kind of take action from a student-focused and student-driven capacity. We also co-host a podcast called Jewish Identity Crisis, where on a more personal level, we kind of go into depth about our own personal identities and how that kind of plays out in a world where we have a nebulous identity in a nebulous time. I don't know if Isaac wants to add anything to that description.
Yeah, Jewish on Campus was born out of a need for more advocacy for Jewish students. With an on frame where it was fitting into the social justice movements and the social justice framework, and started being a bit platforms like Instagram, like Twitter, it's been included here. So we, with the purpose of defending Jewish.
I think his Wi-Fi is cutting out.
I think it's cutting out a little bit, so Julia, you can take over the question.
Yeah, but we saw that social media was this tool that a lot of our peers were using to learn about the world around us, which a lot of the time is really helpful because it exposes us to ideas that we wouldn't otherwise have been exposed to. But it's incomplete because an Instagram graphic talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is never going to give us enough depth that we need to really have this conversation. And so we saw a need for Jewish students to have a platform, to have their voices being heard, and for there to be a mechanism of education around those important topics. That's kind of why we have the organization, which is a place for student-driven change to be created. And then on the other hand, a podcast where we kind of go into these topics that we know change needs to be made around, like Jewish identity, like Zionism, like these different super vague and confusing and complex topics, and going super in depth with them in a way that's both authentic to being a young person in the world right now, but also authentic to our individual experiences.
That's amazing. And I actually would like to ask each and every one of you, why did you personally decide to start Jewish on Campus? What was your motivation as your own person on your own campus? What, sparked inside of you?
So for us to kind of respond to that, I'm not sure if Isaac's Wi-Fi is back, but I can speak to a little bit about my upbringing. So I grew up on Long Island, New York, and similarly to Isaac, I come from a kind of like mixed Jewish background where my mother's family is Israeli from Spain and Yemen and Iraq, and my father's family is they've been in America for 3 generations. They're Ashkenazim from Poland and Romania. So I came with this like kind of combination of all these cultures growing up in a place where being Jewish was pretty normal. So I never really had to explain, like my family, were refugees to Israel. That was an important part of our family story, and never something that I had to justify. But I came to college and that kind of changed because whether it be less exposure to Jewish people growing up or a lack of understanding around the necessity of lots of people to have Israel as a place where your family were refugees to, I kind of kept my mouth shut first year of college. I didn't want to, I knew that I was a Zionist, but I didn't know why. And I didn't want to have to defend something that I wasn't ready to and fully understood. And so when I started seeing how much of a problem this was on my campus, I was meeting other young Jewish people, young Jewish voices who were kind of in a similar place to me. And I'll kind of like speak to how Isaac and I kind of came to do this together. Isaac also comes from a mixed background. He's half Hispano-Portuguese, half Ashkenazi. And he was the first person that I'd ever met that came from a mixed background like me. And it was so refreshing to be like, oh my goodness, we come from this mix of different worlds that are different in distinct ways and similar in distinct ways too. And we became good friends, kind of talking about our identities and our experiences. And then one day Isaac messaged me and he said, I'm starting this Instagram page. We want to share the stories of what's happening on college campuses because it's getting kind of worse. And I'd had experiences like that on my own campus, albeit not to the extent that some of these stories we've collected have been. And so I was on board. I was excited for this project. And really quickly it grew, where we were getting to 2,000 people joining our platform a day. It was an unexpected growth. And what that kind of told us was that that this platform was so needed, that there was this space that was missing for Jewish students to feel like their stories were being heard. And in hearing other people's stories, they realized that they weren't alone in their experiences. So it's kind of how like my individual story plays into the grand scheme of Jewish on Campus. I know Isaac has his own experiences too. I don't want to speak for him, but his story also is really interesting as well.
Thank you for that. Isaac, if your connection allows, you want to do an audio version of that question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, I was in an architecture professional degree program for a while. I came in there from a very tight-knit Panamanian Jewish community, where I was living in, a bubble. I went to an Orthodox Jewish day school for most of my life. I, lived in this world. Being Jewish was just another part of who I was. It wasn't the most important part of my identity. It was just something regular within this bubble. And then I went to architecture school. That's what I wanted to do. And while I was at Cornell, which has a very big Jewish population, it was not the same within the architecture program. I was one of the only few Jewish people. And I was many people's first Jewish person they met going in there, especially some international students. And it felt very isolating in a weird way that I did not expect. But I was also seeing a lot of the newer anti-Semitism in small microaggressions or within classrooms. And that was even more isolating, apart from being one of the only Jewish people within the social circle I was living in. I was also facing anti-Semitism and witnessing it and having no way to connect. But at the same time, I was incredibly busy. I was in this architecture program, which was taking everything out of me. I was, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I had no time to go to Shabbat or celebrate holidays because I had to do work. So I wasn't really finding community while I was seeing anti-Semitism happen on my campus and happen to me. And eventually I transferred out of the architecture program. I study architecture history now, and my time expanded. Now I since I moved out, I think a year ago, I've had much more time to reflect and really look at it from a macro level about what I experience and what I'm seeing on campuses regarding Jewish students, and just regarding in general the environment and the atmosphere at college campuses, and how toxic mentalities and binaries are really taking over the conversation to where we can't have a conversation anymore. And when this summer came to be and I saw such an outpour of Jewish students on social media speaking out about their experiences on college campuses, I said that this space needed to happen. And just on a whim, it happened. It was something to do this summer, and it became what it is now. And I'm glad it did. I think it has been a long time coming.
That's amazing. You touched on something in your intro that I want to go back on. And Isaac, it was you that mentioned kind of how the movements for equality this summer was one of the big catalysts for starting Jewish on Campus. So explain to me how that was the catalyst for your passion for starting this, and how that has kind of helped build a following for Jewish on Campus.
I think that's twofold. I think within the social justice movements, we see some anti-Semitism, and we see Jewish people being excluded from them, as important as they are. Anti-Semitism is in the bottom of the priority list when we know that it's incredibly dangerous. But apart from that, we saw that these frameworks are working. This is bringing attention. So when we see these structures of Instagram accounts which are posting anonymous stories, we said why don't we do the same thing? Why don't we build our own space if we're not being included in these other ones?
I completely agree. You kind of have to build something that brings in all different types of people, because also the Jewish people are all different types of people. We come in all shapes and colors, including me. And there's students on campus that look exactly like me and look exactly like all different other types of people. So I think it's very important to bring each other and everyone in. I have a crowd question, actually. We have Joanne Berenberg. She's an alumni of ours, and she's actually asking Julia, I live and belong to a small Jewish congregation in Colorado, and many of us, including myself, are now in the age group wherein we have grandchildren attending college or recently graduated. Now, she is wondering what the situation is on campus for students regarding anti-Semitism and what she can do to support students on campus.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I think that's kind of the question. What's happening and what can we do about it? And I think what's happening is kind of twofold. Like Isaac has said, there's been this really important push for there to be acknowledgement of justice and social justice. And I think that's extremely important. And I think within that movement, we need to be having conversations about what anti-Semitism is, how, like you'd mentioned, it affects all Jews differently and similarly at the same time, how we come from different backgrounds, we all have this Jewish identity that weaves us all through. And I think a lot of what's happening is people are oftentimes going into it not understanding that what they're saying can be anti-Semitic. So I think that there's like a genuine lack, and kind of twofold, a lack of education and then miseducation. It starts with the lack of education. It starts with not understand. I think that a lot of it kind of ties into misunderstandings around Judaism, around Israel, around what it means to be Jewish. And people think a lot of these things are punching up. They think when they make a comment that, from the river to the sea, that it's punching up at this colonialist force, which is Israel. Or if they make a comment about Jewish-owned media on the other side, I think they're punching up at a group with a position of power. But what they don't understand is that those two forms of anti-Semitism coming from different sides have a root in the same place, which is anti-Semitism and a misinformation of what it means to be a Jewish person. And unfortunately, the burden of proof at this point is on Jewish students because it's Jewish students are allies, and it's hard to find allies a lot of the time on campuses as well because it comes with a lot of social pressure. And so how do we combat this? I think we combat this by speaking our stories and telling our stories as loudly as there are people telling the opposite, is clearing up the misconceptions by having our own narrative and sharing our own narrative. And that's a really intimidating thing to do because a lot of these examples that we're seeing come from students and come from professors, and it come from people who it's intimidating to kind of resist because there is either threat of grades being doxed, like we saw at Johns Hopkins, where a TA quite literally said that she will dox the grades and lower the grades of Jewish students who talk about Zionism, which is, inherently anti-Semitic, and we know that. And then there's, on the other hand, the social pressure. If your friends are all consuming media saying that Israel's an apartheid state and you defend Israel, that's not a very favorable look for you. So having to clear up the misconceptions is really difficult. So my advice for what parents, grandparents, family members can do is to be a mentor, really for encouraging Jewish education and for Jewish pride. I think that it's really important that you come into this conversation not fighting because you're angry as much as you're fighting because you're really proud of being a Jewish person and what that identity means for you. So cultivating that in your grandkids, cultivating that in your children from a young age, I think is really important. And on the flip side, encouraging your children to read a lot of books, to listen to podcasts, to consume education when they come into college so they feel confident enough to combat these narratives, I think is also really important. So that's my two pieces of advice. Yeah.
That's amazing advice, and it's very applicable and very true. I mean, the best defense and the best offense to what we're seeing on campus is really just students on the ground, both going into college with a certain level of knowledge, but even if they don't have that knowledge, just building and attaining that knowledge while they're in college and learning what they can about, what it means to actually be a Jew, to be a Zionist, the dynamic that plays in on campus. And it kind of points me to a question of the why. Why do you think that the demonization of Israel, of Zionism, of Zionists, and the the punching up mentality of Jews towards Jews in terms of this kind of new anti-Semitism, why do you think these have become so normalized on campus?
As I was saying before, we're living in a time where even though we say that we reject binaries, ironically, we really don't. And we see everything on a gray, like on a black and white like level, and you can't fall anywhere in the middle. You can't have nuance. It's either something is good and something is bad. And Israel and Zionism has been deemed as bad. I remember reading this summer this tablet article by Isabella Tabarovsky, which I like highly recommend, called The American Soviet Mentality. And it kind of goes like, it compares what's happening now in America in the social scene with what happened in the Soviet Union, and how that parallels with Zionism being like this new form of anti-Semitism. It's not something new. It's something that has happened before, and college campuses are the breeding ground of it. Academic circles is where it starts to happen. So anti-Semitism is not something that's isolated. It's a symptom of a society where it's at a boiling point. And anti-Semitism is part of that, but there are other like many types of symptoms that are happening. Jews just happen to always, fall in the smack middle of these things.
Julia, do you have anything you want to say on that, or?
Yeah, I think kind of what Isaac has said is a huge part of it too, that whenever there is a time of uncertainty throughout history, it always falls on the Jews to kind of bear the brunt of that blame, like the eternal scapegoat. And I think a lot of that is because the definition of what anti-Semitism isn't a fixed thing. It morphs itself to fit into the society in which it's existing. So in the Soviet Union, when the capitalist was like the ultimate evil, Jews were the capitalists. And then in the Red Scare in the United States, McCarthyism, when communism was the ultimate evil, the Jew was the communist. And in the same capacity, Israel is like the eternal Jew. It's the Jew among states. When there are the ultimate good is human rights, and for a good reason. Israel becomes that scapegoat. Israel becomes the ultimate human rights violator, which we see on college campuses, and we see even up to the structures of the United Nations, which aren't immune to anti-Semitism either. And a lot of the times these claims are deeply rooted in anti-Semitism, are deeply rooted in anti-Semitism. The fact that the People's Republic of China can sit on a human rights committee, but the number one recipient of human rights abuses in the United Nations is Israel, is another symptom of that same anti-Semitism morphing to fit the society in which it exists. And I think we have to be aware of that and aware of the nebulous nature of anti-Semitism if we ever hope to combat it in an efficient way.
Yeah, and what Isaac touched on, and you also touched on there, was the legacy of Soviet-era propaganda. What a lot of people don't understand is that what we see as modern anti-Zionism was started as a purposeful policy of propaganda by Soviet officials, and it's identical. There's nothing different between now and the policies that were created by Soviet officials, which makes it even more hard because it's a level of propaganda that has been attempted for decades and decades and decades, long before it even became a talking point on college campuses, long before even anti-Zionism, Zionism equals racism was a resolution in the UN, long before that. So it makes it even harder to build a case against something that's already, argued its case for decades and decades. And I think now we're starting to see also a change in how Jewish advocates are responding to anti-Zionism, are responding to anti-Semitism. And we recently had the executive order, or recently within the last couple of years, had the executive order labeling Judaism as a nationality under Title 6 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. How do you feel that'll help, or maybe even hurt, the tide of anti-Semitic activity on campuses?
So we were having a conversation actually a couple weeks back with a lawyer who was explaining a little bit about this to us. You can, even without the executive order, there is an argument to be made for Judaism to be protected, for Jewish students to be protected under Title VI without the executive order or with it, just by the idea of ethnicity, because Judaism, it's about how you define. In my opinion, it's not about how you define, and I'm not a legal scholar, so please take this as a 19-year-old giving you a legal opinion, but it's not about how you define Title VI as much as it's about how you define Judaism. So the understanding of Judaism as just a religion is flawed in the capacity that it's also an ethnic component. There's a degree of similar ancestry, there's a degree of similar background, and there's a degree of similar history and collective persecution that we faced throughout our history as well. So I think that's also kind of something that I think will last longer than an executive order, is an understanding of what it means to be a Jew. And I think, like, again, I'm not a legal scholar, but that's my 2 cents on the matter.
Isaac, would you like to chime in at all?
I think it, like, it could help. I don't know within the legal framework. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know much about government, but I think there's an argument to be made about Jewish nationhood, and that's something that has dwindled within the diaspora, especially in America, and something that I've witnessed as a difference coming in as a person who's not American. But without that understanding of Jewish nationhood, we can't fully understand anti-Semitism and the discrimination against us. And of course, that doesn't mean that Jewish people aren't American or aren't fully any nationality, but it's something that needs to be understood within a historical context about how Jewish people function as a global community in the same way that many other diaspora groups function within global communities. And I've seen many Jewish people kind of object to it with this, like, failure to understand within a larger context, or saying, like, this is saying that Jews aren't American. I'm like, no, you need to, like, stand back and understand how we have maintained a, like, 3,000-year-old identity that comes from the same, like, nation, the same kingdom of, like, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and how anti-Semitism doesn't only function on a religious level. And in my opinion, that's not the way it's being manifested in the moment, but it is a combination of, like, 2,000 years of, like, building on this ethno-religious construct, which is the Jewish people. It has so many different aspects, and we see it, like, within the Inquisition and within the Holocaust, of how Jewish people have been targeted in different ways. So we need to, like, I think, try to understand it instead of, like, directly attack it. I think that it has, like, the potential of being a good thing.
Yeah, and I think part of it is understanding both how this executive order will affect on the activist side in terms of the actual success or failure of anti-Zionist activism on campus, and then also the legal side in terms of actual legal challenges and the ability to hold them accountable legally. And there's a lot to it. And, also I'm not a legal professional, so it's hard to make the case on how to affect the climate overall legally, but it is something that's always wonder how it affects campuses socially, because it's especially in light of the new reality that we live in politically. It's going to be interesting to see how something that has had positive effects for Jewish students across the country and has led to multiple Title VI cases being brought up against universities, now having this cloud over it of being instituted being implemented, by a presidency that isn't viewed well in general, but also isn't viewed well by anti-Zionists, and how much that's also going to influence their activism against and messaging against the executive order.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of why, as activists, there has to be a focus that isn't just institutional. And I think that's where a lot of the shift has been recently, that there's something to be said for talking to a university administration, but there's something different to be said by working directly on campus culture. Because the fact is, you know, when your peers are all kind of engaging in like we were saying, anti-Semitic rhetoric through the anti-Semitic view of anti-Zionism, that's a completely different conversation that's handled in a totally different way. And I think that like as young people, a lot of the power of our voices is understanding the mentality of other young people, understanding the mentality of our peers, and using that understanding to best convey Zionism in a way that's not the misconception, in a way that isn't tied to anything negative, but is just our experiences as college students. And I think that that is really important because it applies to Jewish students through a broad spectrum of identities, a broad spectrum of backgrounds, a broad spectrum of political beliefs, a broad spectrum of how their Jewishness relates to them. Because Zionism does not mean one political thing to everyone. Zionism is not just a political conversation. It's a conversation of peoplehood. It's a conversation of escaping this persecution that's followed us throughout our entire existence as a people, and having a place to kind of have as the Jewish homeland. That, if you read any like Sephardi poetry from the 1400s, it's always talking about longing for the East, longing for Zion. And that's not a political thing, that's a spiritual thing too. And I think once we kind of move past the messy politics of it and talk about it in the sense of like, this is our experience as Jewish people, we'll be more productive in making positive change.
And you kind of alluded to it with your reference to Mizrahi poetry. That really is the rub there. It's where our detractors are so obsessed with this idea that it seemingly looks like that, Zionism just sprouted out of nowhere in the 19th century. And the reality is that it didn't. It just never really seemed as much as a necessary ideal. It seemed very far off, something that we really couldn't touch. And it's just recently where we've had this ability to really visualize it due to necessity, obviously, but that doesn't increase or decrease the legitimacy of our Zionism. Our Zionism has been there since we were kicked out of the land of our ancestors. And it's just now that we're actually able to have a home. And that also changes the narrative too, because now that we have a home, being anti-Zionist is no longer being anti an idea, it's being anti an actual nation of people that currently exist in this world, on this earth. So it's far more than being against an idea of self-determination. It's actually being against the existence of something that exists and where people live. I got a question from the crowd from Daniel Hintner. Yes, in your opinion and from your experiences, what is the biggest driving force behind the majority of anti-Semitic activities on college campuses?
I think it's anti-Zionism, and that's kind of the trend that we see in our data. I think it's like about 70% of our data is actually anti-Zionist rhetoric as anti-Semitism from our Jewish on campus database. As I was saying before, I think that anti-Zionism, as it's appearing in the United States and as it's been appearing in progressive spaces, as it's appearing on American college campuses, is a symptom of a larger issue that we're seeing in the United States of a lot of change happening.
Awesome. I got another question from the crowd. Lindsay LeBoyer, or LeBoyer. Whichever way it's pronounced, I apologize for butchering that. She asks, as Jews and especially as mixed Jews, how do you navigate the white POC binary that we see in social justice spaces and increasingly in society at large? And then also tying that into another question, because I do think it's relevant, that does have an effect on the dynamic with organizations like If Not Now, JVP, and their ability to recruit and be successful. How does that binary, I guess, affect Zionist progressive Jews' ability to, you know, both bring in our anti-Zionist Jewish brothers and sisters back into the tent and also change the narrative for our non-Jewish brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to remember that this idea of anti-Zionism being tied to progressivism is like a very much new concept in American politics in particular. It's not a new concept globally. And I think we can kind of look to the UK and see examples of that. But I don't think that it needs to necessarily be a concept with permanence. I think that a lot of it comes from miseducation, not a lack of education, but a miseducation. So when it's kind of coming from professors, it's taken with them a level of credence. And I think it's important to acknowledge that like Jews don't fit into like the binary of like, we're kind of this nebulous thing. We are distinct, a lot of the time there are people who are born Jewish with a distinct ancestry back to like Eretz Israel 3,000 years ago, and people who convert into Judaism and take on this identity. We're this mix of so much different like background with a similar kind of thread throughout the entire thing. So it's hard to fit such an identity into that conversation, which I think we should try not. I don't think we should try to. I don't think it's going to fit. I don't think there's any reason to try to force it into that conversation because it's just not going to work. I think it's important to remember that. And I think in terms of progressive spaces, I think that this ideology has always been kind of fringe, and it's scary to see how it's becoming more mainstream, like at Tufts University with 25% of the student body voting in favor of the deadly exchange referendum. I think it's important for Jewish students who, like from any political background, but speaking directly to this question, for Jewish students who have progressive politics or have liberal politics to continue to go into those spaces. It's really important to, because if your voice isn't in that space, the only voices that will be in that space are anti-Zionist. So I think like speaking in my own personal experience, like it's important for you to be able to have your own political beliefs about America and then have your own political beliefs about Israel, because those are two totally different things. And there's no reason why they should be conflated. And if we don't talk about both, then you're not ever going to make any change in that political space. It's just going to continue to spiral.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say, I mean, I totally agree. I think that nuance is necessary, Julia, as you are implying. These are different conversations, American politics, Israeli politics, where you can like have so much difference. And I think one solution, like the real solution, is not to force ourselves into this rhetoric, not to force ourselves into trying to fit our history and our identities, which are like precede American politics and like American progressive spaces by thousands of years. Like we can't fit that in there. So I see like this phrase a lot that says like include Jews in your activism. And I ask myself, like, do we want to be included in activism that is inherently flawed? Or do we want to be a part of a movement in which Jewish people being so directly and blatantly affected are part of the key of opening up the conversation into bringing in this nuance, into bringing in debate and healthy conversations, instead of being like, this is good and this is bad and having no gray area. And I think that's how we will be able to really solve this issue. And I think that like in coalitions with people like us and other young activists, like that is something that it holds so much value and so much power. But I think to see ourselves as part of a larger movement is how we fit into the progressive world, and not just seeing ourselves as facing anti-Semitism from the progressive movement, like because the progressive movement hates us. That's not what's going on. It's a larger issue, and it's because there are flaws in the progressive movement, as there are flaws in many movements. And you're mentioning, if not now, and I think that's kind of a separate conversation. And to be completely blunt, I think that if you look throughout history, there's always been Jewish people who have gone against the interests of the majority of Jewish people. And I think instead of trying to like re-educate people who clearly don't want to be like educated, I think we need to like educate our kids and high school students and middle schoolers and prepare them to have these tough conversations in college campuses. And people like us, like don't focus your energy on trying to like educate the fringe, but try to focus your energy and trying to like change the education, like the Jewish education system and the Jewish organizations into being really effective, into not letting Jewish people fall into these traps, and being made to think that in order to be a progressive person, in order to be a good person within this new framework, that you have to let go of part of your identity, that you have to let go of your Zionist identity. That's just totally not true. So we have to really have tough conversations of Israel, have tough conversations about Jewish identity, and really delve into that history, really teach Jewish kids where they are from and why their Jewish identity is important. And I think that will really like give them the framework to like change this really powerful narrative that we see, which is actually fringe.
Yeah, I think based on the most recent AJC poll, it had it somewhere around at most 12% of American Jews do not have a strong connection to the phrase or to the idea that Israel is a valuable piece, and in the connection to Israel is a valuable piece of Jewish identity. So it is very much fringe, and it always has been fringe. And for some reason, people have this obsession with thinking that the fringe now is different than the fringe before, when they don't realize the fringe in the Soviet Union, even there is the fringe in Nazi Germany, or much larger groups of anti-Semitic at times and anti-Zionist Jews who weren't for the Jewish people overall, and some of them pay dire consequences for it in the end. But it kind of touches back to what we've been talking about this whole time, is what's happening on campus seems to do a lot with a lack of education about the history of anti-Semitism. And I don't even put that's not on fault of the students. It's on fault of the parents who didn't educate their kids enough about the true history of the Jewish people, on what it means to be a Jew, what anti-Semitism is. It's on the educators who are, tweaking the educational system to not teach us about these fringe groups that have, helped to build movements that weren't positive for the Jewish people. So it's, there's a lot there that goes into the issue that we're having now with our brothers and sisters not having our backs, not supporting us. And it's a harsh reality. And I agree with you. I don't know if there's really anything that we can do. I don't think, education, at least with them, is going to solve anything. If anything, education is going to get them to flip in 10, 20, 30 years. But what are we going to do when they're on campus? That's the hard thing. And you're actually dealing with students on campus. You're actually getting their testimonials, learning about their situations. Do you feel that what Jewish on Campus has been able to do since this summer has had a major impact on the reality for students, or at least the mental health of Jewish and Zionist students across the country?
So I think that we definitely have seen, and I would hope it has something to do with what we started, but I think recently in the past short bit, we've seen a significant increase in Jewish students talking about our experiences, talking about anti-Semitism. And I think part of that has to do with kind of a ripple effect. So I was really, scared at first to talk about my experience with anti-Semitism, my experience with anti-Zionism as a part of anti-Semitism, because I didn't want to be the only one talking about it. And I saw that there was a community of people who were talking about it too, and I felt empowered to begin that conversation. And since then, I've seen lots of people who, like, I've known from school who are talking about it too. And the ones they started speaking about it, there are more people speaking about it. And I think there's this kind of ripple effect of like permission, and you should never need permission to talk about what's happening, but a sense that we have the permission to talk about it, which I think is something in a narrative that like we really need to combat. We don't need permission to talk about our experiences. This is happening, and that I had some experiences first year of college where I remember someone had made a comment to me about Nazi Germany, and I was very upset by it. And I explained it away in my head. I was like, it wasn't anti-Semitic, it was just a joke. I have to move on. And it wasn't until I heard other people's stories that I said to myself, this was an anti-Semitic incident, and lots of other things happened too my entire life that I kind of explained away. And I think once we stop explaining away what happened to us and telling our stories in important ways, that's really powerful. And like, kind of on a similar note, kind of on a different note, I think it's really important not to underestimate the power of college students, especially the Jewish community on college campuses. I think a really inspiring example of that is Soviet Jewry, when there was obviously a tremendous amount of persecution happening to Soviet Jewry. It was in large part the demonstrations of college students in the United States, American college students who were Jewish, who were campaigning for there to be refugees brought to the United States, that pushed for that to happen. So this is not a fruitless campaign. There are examples of success, and we have to use those examples to inspire us to continue in that same vein.
Amazing. I completely agree, and I think it is important to keep the hope alive, because I think there are a significant amount of students that we can lead back to the conclusion that the Jewish people are people that are worth our time, attention, thought, are the time that we're going to put into education, the time that we're going to put into allyship and activism. And we actually have a student on the call who's a incoming high school student, and they are actually a non-Jewish high school student. And they are actually wondering, how can they, and specifically non-Jewish people in general, best show up as allies on campus for Jewish students?
That's an amazing question. And to the person who asked it, thank you so much for being here. I think that's wonderful. And you asking that question just is amazing. And it's a rare thing. So again, thank you. I think the best way is to try to educate yourself as much as you can, and hearing conversations like this, and not let yourself be driven by the anti-Semitism that has become mainstream. So if you're going to go to college, like you're going to college now, where things are exponentially changing. We saw like the deadly exchange in Tufts. We're seeing BDS like go through, stand with your Jewish friends against these types of resolutions in student assemblies, stand with your Jewish friends, like when these campaigns come out, because it's really important that we have the support of other people, and it's not just our community speaking out. So whether it is like giving support to your Jewish friends on your campus, or taking a stand against that, I think that is kind of the best way. Julia, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think a lot of kind of a reality of being a Jewish person is that we are 0.2% of the global population. We're 2% of the American population. We are a very, very, very small minority group. And as much as we can fight and campaign for anti-Semitism, that can't happen without support from allies. And so I think there's a certain level of like people will listen to what you have to say because you're seen as kind of like impartial. So when your Jewish friends explain to you like where we come from, if you can go into the spaces that you are and to continue defending us even when we're not around, to continue to use, you know, your voice to amplify our voices too. I think I've seen a lot of that kind of arising in the past couple of months, which has been really inspiring to see. And I think it's really important to understand that every friend will need you as an ally and will need you as a friend. And those are two different jobs. And to not neglect the friendship part for the allyship part, because sometimes when something bad happens, when an anti-Semitic event happens, it's all over social media, all over, you know, our timelines. Sometimes we just need someone to check in and be like, how are you doing? And that's also an important part of allyship too. So balancing that like educational and empowering aspect of it, but also just being a friend and listening and making space for your Jewish friends to the most of your capacity sounds pretty basic, but is something that I think can often be overlooked in importance.
Amazing. I have a lot of questions here, but I think I'm going to do one more question and then we're going to wrap it up pretty shortly. And then we're going to say our last words. But I have a question from Noah Katz, and he is asking about, you know, your peers on campus who may or may not be Jewish, may or may not, you know, have any knowledge of Zionism or Israel or Jews whatsoever, that's whether purposely or accidentally spout anti-Semitic rhetoric. How do you, your fellow Jewish student leaders, Zionist student leaders, and just the general Jewish population, how are you as a unit combating this rhetoric, and how are you as an organization providing a space where these students can be safe from anti-Semitism, from anti-Zionism?
Yeah, first of all, hi, Noah. Second of all, this is a really good question. And I think I've actually, I'll kind of answer with some stories. There are times when you will see someone post on their Instagram story, you know, the post, and I'm going to use Instagram story because we're in a pandemic and a lot of time these interpersonal interactions are happening online, which I think is another part of the problem because it is very empowering to kind of just spew things you don't understand when you see a graphic and you share it in your story. And there are less consequences to that than there would be if you're talking about this in an in-person conversation. But if someone's posting, you know, from the river to the sea, or posting something that is like blatantly anti-Semitic, if someone's talking about, I think we could talk about the CNN article that went out yesterday, which quotes talking about Jewish supremacy, which is a phrase coined by David Duke, who obviously is the most well-known modern day white supremacist. So that's just like, if you see someone posting something like that, there is no need to engage in that conversation as an individual person, in my opinion, because you're never going to change their mind. Like that's a waste of your time, a waste of your energy, a waste of your emotion. In my opinion, when those conversations need to be had is with someone who is more open to listening to you. So I've had friends reach out to me who said, like, you know, Julia, I know you. I know that you always stand for right things and good things. You don't really seem like the kind of person who's going to stand for like colonialism. So why are you a Zionist? And like that was basically almost word for word a question that someone sent to me one time. And I sat down with that friend and I, for like half an hour, wrote out this entire explanation of why I support the existence of the state of Israel, what Zionism means to me as a young person, as a Jew, as an American, as someone whose family is from Israel, as all of my identities. And I explained it all to her, and she kind of responded by saying, you know, I never understood what Zionism was. I kind of just heard all these like crazy explanations from different sides, and you explained it in a way that makes sense to me, and I get where you're coming from now. And I think those conversations are really worth having. But I think there's no point in getting into a screaming match over DMs, or, you know, there's no point in those conversations, and leave that and keep promoting what you have to say in spaces where people will listen to you, because quite frankly, those straw man arguments are really easy to see through to someone who's like really critically thinking about it anyway. And if you can present your argument in a more like rational way, I think more people will give it credence. I don't know if Isaac has anything to add to that question.
I think that was incredibly well put. Thank you.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. So, now you're almost at 30,000 followers on Instagram. I think, I think I started following when it was like 2,000 or 3,000. And that was only the summer, and the sky's the limit for the both of you and your organization. What's next for Jewish on Campus?
So there's a lot next for Jewish on Campus, especially hopefully COVID will come to an end at some point, and we will have on campus things happening. We have kind of a redesign of the organization, what we envision it as, because we started as a social media driven organization. Obviously that's not sustainable forever. Like, we started essentially as a campaign with putting out stories of anonymous accounts of anti-Semitism, and that can't go on forever. Of course, like, we need to collect the data and we need to put those stories out there, but the question for what's next is how are we changing this issue? How are we empowering young Jewish people? How are we giving, most importantly, how are we giving young Jewish people like us, like young alumni, like high school students, not only the tools to navigate anti-Semitism on college campuses, but a space? Because I think that's the most necessary thing. I think personally, and with the risk of sounding pessimistic, I think we're never going to go back. We're never going to go back to the welcoming, amazing spaces that never existed on college campuses for Jewish people. It's not going to be as good as it was 9 years ago, where like it was already starting to get bad. I think that we need to face a new reality. And for this reason, we have to build spaces where young Jewish people like us can convene, can talk about ideas freely, can talk about Zionism, can read together, can have forums. So I think, without saying too much, from what's coming, you will see that soon. Hopefully, that's what we're aiming to become.
And last but not least, how can alumni support you in that mission and be a support for Jewish Zionist students on campus?
So hopefully soon we will have our 501c3 pull through, and you will be able to donate, and that will make a great change. So donating, but not only that, I think, that being said, that being put aside, which will be important, I think the way to support us is being aware and being keen on what's going on college campuses, listening to conversations like these and spreading it, while also putting pressure. You're an alumni, you went to an organization. If you go to Tufts, if you go to Columbia, things are happening on that campus. Put pressure on your alma mater. Like, tell them you will not donate until they make a statement, until they condemn BDS. You have power here if you're an alumni at one of these universities, and we need your support.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for hopping on this webinar with us. We loved hearing from you. And as alumni, our main concern is how can we support US students on the ground and just make your college experience easier. We want you to experience all the highs that we experience and none of the lows. And obviously that won't happen, but we're going to get as close to that as we can. So, let's keep moving forward. Thank you for hopping on this call with us. And we're excited to see what Jewish on Campus becomes over the next couple months, years, decades, centuries.
Thank
you
you
so
for
much.
having us. It was so great
It
to
was a
speak with
pleasure.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.